Oi, gente, bom dia. Desculpa pela demora. A gente está com alguns problemas técnicos aqui, que uma das participantes, a Françoise Vergier, não está conseguindo logar. Ela participou do primeiro dia e conseguiu entrar direitinho, mas agora ela não está conseguindo entrar e a gente está tentando resolver isso, mas não conseguimos ainda. Então a gente decidiu admitir vocês e de repente a gente vai começando e o Vini aqui do nosso núcleo vai tentar ajudá-la a fazer esse login, tá? Então desculpem aí pela demora, mas a gente estava tentando fazer com que todo mundo estivesse aqui para começar. Tá bom? Então, vamos começar. Eu vou começar em português e depois eu vou passar para inglês, tá? Então, só para lembrar, né? Bem-vindos, né? Ao nosso quarto dia do seminário, a Vida Psíquica da Política Internacional. Eu lembro que a gente tem tradução simultânea, né? É só apertar naquele globinho ali embaixo, Interpretation, escolher a língua para a qual vocês querem tradução e lembrar de colocar no mudo a língua original. E, de novo, gostaria de agradecer muito aos nossos intérpretes que estão aqui ajudando esse seminário a funcionar. Welcome to the fourth day of our seminar, The Psychic Life of International Politics. Before we proceed, I would like to remind you that there is simultaneous translation for the seminar, enabled by the team of trainee interpreters from the Conference Interpreter Training Program of PUC-Rio. We thank the team once again for their indispensable work. If you need to activate the translation, just click on the globe icon on the bottom right of your Zoom and select the language into which you need the translation. Then select Mute Original Audio. To get back to hearing the speakers in their original language, just click on the same globe and select Off. So today's panel is called Planetary Catastrophe, Denial and Disavowal. Our current predicament has been called global warming, climate change, climate crisis, ecological emergency, ecological crisis, environmental catastrophe, among many other names. Our current epoch has been called the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Racial Capitalocene, Thanatocene, among many other names. These names intend to capture and generate different understandings of which processes led to what we're facing, who this we refers to, and what should be done about it. It, in its many names and understandings, has become a pervasive topic of contemporary international politics. This year, the United States is no longer denying that it exists and is apparently leading a global effort to tackle it, as we saw last week with the US-organized Leaders Summit on Climate, a forerunner to the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which will take place in November in Scotland. These events gave rise to mild optimism in some quarters and profound skepticism in others. And this joined the plethora of already existing feelings circulating around this issue. What we aim to discuss here today, then, is this complex affective economy of planetary catastrophe. For that, we have three amazing speakers, I hope. I think Françoise has not entered. She has? Oh, she's here? Oh, great. Great, amazing. I'm relieved. Okay, so we have three amazing speakers. We will begin with Débora Danowski, who is a professor at the Philosophy Department at PUC-Rio. She has extensive experience researching and publishing on early modern philosophy, and also in the last decade on the Anthropocene, the ecological emergency, and climate change denial. Among her many publications, we highlight the book A Mundo por Vir, Ensaios sobre os Medos e os Fins, co-authored with Eduardo Viveiro de Castro, which has been translated and published in French, Italian, German, Spanish, and English under the title The Ends of the World, and the book Negacionismos, published by N-1 in 2019. So, Deborah, I give the floor to you.
Good morning, everybody. Eu vou falar em português, desculpa. Então, bom dia. Paula, muito obrigada. Agradeço demais o convite de vocês todos, do IRI, né, para esse evento. Eu estou acompanhando todos os dias, mas sem poder participar, enfim, estou acompanhando junto com outros, né, como a gente tem feito ultimamente. Então, é uma honra falar aqui para vocês. Eu vou imediatamente ler o meu texto, eu vou ler em português, né, para todo mundo poder aqui acompanhar melhor. Todos aqueles que levamos a sério a realidade e a gravidade do aquecimento global e da ruptura dos outros parâmetros necessários à manutenção de grande parte da atual vida terrestre, são de alguma forma transportados ou tomados pela imaginação de um mundo futuro muito diferente e pior do que o nosso mundo presente. Quer esperem que esse futuro distópico possa ser evitado, ou temam que ele acontecerá inevitavelmente e atingirá a todos, ainda que de maneira não uniforme, sua percepção é repetidamente deslocada, seu ponto de vista mudado em um ponto de vista vindo de um tempo alheio, de outras gentes, próximas a nós ou distantes, sujeitos de todo tipo, que terão ou teriam experimentado a catástrofe climática e ecológica, e com ela muitas outras catástrofes econômica, social, psicológica, institucional, etc. Ou seja, daqueles que terão perdido o seu mundo e que, entretanto, deverão viver no que resta e com o que resta de um mundo. O ponto de vista daqueles mesmos que talvez olhem para trás, buscando entender o mistério da conjugação dos avanços científicos com a paralisia política, ou pior, com o suicídio político da nossa época. Mas, nessas últimas décadas, conforme foi se agravando a emergência climática, junto com essa estabilidade perceptiva, é notável uma forte instabilidade afetiva, além de um sentimento de inadequação dos velhos nomes e descrições atribuídos pela filosofia, especialmente a filosofia moderna, às chamadas paixões da alma. Então, discussões acerca da esperança e do medo, por exemplo, têm sido frequentes, né, com perguntas como: o que devemos sentir diante dos acontecimentos e dos cenários futuros? O que é mais promissor como móvel das nossas ações políticas? É justo dar esperança? É correto amedrontar? E, a depender da ênfase da narrativa, da análise em um ou outro desses dois afetos, o sujeito será dito otimista ou pessimista. Além da esperança e do medo, há muitas outras paixões em situação de labilidade. Fala-se repetidamente em apreensão, desespero, desconexão, solidão, ceticismo, desilusão, indiferença, melancolia, raiva, tristeza, para citar só alguns desses sentimentos ou afetos que têm surgido reiteradamente em relatos, seja de pessoas e povos que já estão sofrendo diretamente os impactos das mudanças climáticas, seja de cientistas do sistema Terra, seja, enfim, de todas as pessoas preocupadas com o que está acontecendo à nossa volta e globalmente. Os Inuit do Canadá descrevem o clima mais ameno como devastador, deprimente, frustrante, triste, assustador. Os aborígenes da região do Upper Hunter, no leste da Austrália, relatam um tipo de tristeza para a qual o filósofo Glenn Albert sugeriu um neologismo, a solastalgia. Diante da devastação das suas terras milenares pelas minas de carvão a céu aberto, pela poluição das fábricas e pela seca, a solastalgia se referiria, segundo ele, eu cito, a saudade que se sente quando ainda se está em casa. O mesmo povo fala ainda da sensação de perder um braço, de estar preso numa armadilha. O povo Yanomami, narram o medo da queda do céu e avisam que os seus xamãs estão dançando para evitar a queda do céu, mas que não conseguirão segurar o céu para eles e para os brancos durante muito tempo com as suas danças. Os cientistas do sistema Terra confessam não apenas a sua tristeza e desolação ao testemunharem a morte de corais, o silêncio dos campos despovoados de insetos e pássaros, o derretimento de gigantescas placas de gelo, as secas cada vez mais duras e longas, os incêndios florestais, os furacões e as enchentes devastadoras, mas também a sua frustração e mesmo depressão diante da inação dos governos e grandes empresas para mitigar os impactos futuros, apesar dos seus avisos. Céus, mares, montanhas, rios, moradores das grandes e pequenas cidades, povos das florestas ou das regiões semiáridas, Ribeirinhos, quilombolas, crianças e adolescentes em todos os cantos do mundo gritam o seu medo de não ter um mundo para viver. E não poderia ser de outra forma. Quando nós dizemos que tudo está em mutação, que o que nós estamos vivendo hoje é claramente uma perda de mundo, não estamos nos referindo apenas ao clima ou à paisagem ao nosso redor, ao pano de fundo, né, onde nós e outros existentes nascemos, crescemos, formamos sociedades, etc. Corpos de todas as espécies também são eles próprios zonas críticas e respondem diferentemente às mutações climáticas. Eu vou dar alguns exemplos dessa estreita relação entre as percepções da alma e os afetos ou afecções do corpo. Primeiro, uma série de estudos vem mostrando uma queda acentuada da fertilidade de diversas populações humanas, masculinas e femininas, nas últimas décadas, causada provavelmente pelo efeito cumulativo de produtos químicos tóxicos, como ftalatos e o bisfenol B. Em entrevista, a epidemiologista norte-americana especialista em reprodução Shanna Swan disse que, se essa tendência continuar, daqui a 2 décadas, a maior parte dos casais que quiserem ter filhos vão ter que apelar para a reprodução assistida. Segundo exemplo, com o risco de estarmos em meio à 6ª grande extinção em massa da história da vida na Terra, vários cientistas têm investigado também o que eles chamam de aniquilação biológica, ou uma extirpação ou dizimação populacional da vida selvagem, que costumam acontecer antes da extinção propriamente dita. Em todas as etapas desses processos de degradação, os efeitos vão se fazendo sentir nos corpos e, consequentemente, nos afetos da alma. Pensemos no estudo de Carlson e outros autores, mostrando a preocupante queda na biodiversidade dos parasitas presentes em diversos organismos, inclusive no corpo humano. Segundo a pesquisa, 30% dos parasitas estão em risco de extinção por impacto das mudanças climáticas, por perda de habitats adequados ou por risco de coextinção, porque, por definição, parasitas dependem de outras espécies para sobreviver. As consequências, evidentemente, são muitas e imprevisíveis. Terceiro e último exemplo. No seu livro Falter, o ativista Bill McKibben relata alguns estudos sugerindo que o aumento da concentração de dióxido de carbono no ar que respiramos diminui a nossa capacidade de raciocínio. Com uma concentração de 1000 partes por milhão, que está dentro das possibilidades projetadas pelo IPCC antes de 2100, a capacidade cognitiva humana cairia 21%. Isso, pensemos, ao mesmo tempo em que o aumento da temperatura, além de acarretar grandes perdas nas safras de alguns dos alimentos, e dos alimentos mais consumidos no mundo, como milho, trigo, arroz, terá levado também a uma forte diminuição da sua qualidade nutritiva. Bem, colocando tudo isso junto, a gente já pode ver que se a gente nunca fomos 100% humanos, para parodiar o título do livro do Bruno Latour, jamais fomos modernos, se já éramos apenas 10% humanos, o que somos agora que os nossos corpos e alimentos estão sofrendo alterações de tal magnitude? E o que seremos num futuro não tão distante? Corpos mutantes em um mundo mutante, como esperar que as nossas percepções e afetos não se modifiquem também? Bem, como eu não tenho muito tempo, eu vou me concentrar aqui em apenas 2 desses afetos. Vários filósofos que se debruçaram sobre os sentimentos humanos trataram longamente do medo e do seu inverso, a esperança. Esses 2 afetos existem ali onde há incerteza, quer a respeito de um bem, quer a respeito de um mal por vir. Onde não há incerteza, o que existe é a alegria ou tristeza e o desespero. Mas, vistas um pouco mais de longe esses sentimentos, essas paixões, podemos dizer que a esperança é um dos afetos símbolo da modernidade, fundada, entre outras coisas, na ideia de que o tempo segue sempre numa única direção e que essa direção leva, no final, a um estado melhor do que aquele estado miserável do qual partimos e ao qual não queremos voltar. Esperança é adiamento e espera. Do progresso, espera do progresso, da abundância, da paz, das luzes, do desenvolvimento, da realização, da história, do paraíso reencontrado, do reino, do futuro prometido. O modernismo é intrinsecamente otimista, portanto, ao passo que o pessimismo costuma ser visto como uma disposição retrógrada, reacionária, típica de nihilistas descrentes ou de primitivistas saudosos de uma origem fantasiosa. Mas, com a nossa entrada no antropoceno, alguns têm sugerido que nós devemos abrir mão da esperança, pois essa nos faz acreditar em falsas soluções, como se os problemas estivessem todos dados e pudessem ser dispostos, né, em sua totalidade, em cima de uma mesa, de modo que alguém, que nunca somos nós, quer dizer, nunca somos os coletivos, a sociedade civil, os povos autônomos, soubesse como fazer esses problemas desaparecer de uma vez por todas, como num passe de mágica ou num passe de gerenciamento e de alta tecnologia. Por isso, segundo esses autores, é só quando nós abandonarmos a esperança que nos tornaremos capazes de agir, de resistir e de combater os responsáveis pela destruição. Mas, por outro lado, o medo não é menos criticado. Ele também paralisa e mata, sobretudo quando é capturado pelo Estado, que vê grandes oportunidades nos momentos de catástrofe para se livrar dos seus opositores e de todo tipo de empecilhos e regulações. Podemos dizer que, nesse sentido, o medo é um afeto fascista, ou melhor, é um afeto que convém e, por isso, é de bom grado alimentado por nacionalismos xenófobos e outras tendências de direita. Também, nesse sentido, ele é o inverso da esperança, porque cria inimigos fictícios e preconceitos em todo canto, cria muros e, no final das contas, também desespera. Daí as acusações muito frequentemente dirigidas pela própria esquerda às ativistas ambientais de serem pessimistas e catastrofistas. É preciso, né, diriam eles, é preciso alertar para os perigos e denunciar os interesses por trás das grandes indústrias, do capital, etc., mas dosando as palavras e sem exageros. Se assustarmos as pessoas, nós corremos o risco de desmobilizá-las. Bem, eu penso que essas críticas a ambos os sentimentos, o medo e a esperança, se justificam por boas razões, mas outras razões nos mostram que nós não devemos fazer avaliações apressadas, porque afetos não são monolitos sentimentais, nossas almas são inclinadas por motivos múltiplos, móveis e contraditórios. Sim, existe uma esperança, a esperança placebo, como disse Ailton Krenak, que funciona como um dispositivo do capitalismo neoliberal e que, enquanto tal, destrói, ainda no berço, qualquer sentimento de revolta e de resistência, qualquer ímpeto de ação coletiva e de invenção de saídas. Mas há também um outro tipo de esperança. Como dizer que ela não deveria existir ou que deveria ser combatida quando vemos, para tomar um exemplo bem do nosso momento agora, quando vemos o rosto das pessoas que estão prestes a serem vacinadas contra a Covid-19. Se essas pessoas não tivessem esperança, elas sequer sairiam de casa, eu creio. Sendo que uma questão seria pensar, né, sobre os que vão às festas e aglomeração, será que eles também têm esperança? Né? Esperança de quê? Talvez, ou talvez tenham medo, ou talvez o seu afeto seja o outro, seja o desejo de morte, a pulsão de morte, enfim. Outro exemplo seriam relatos de minorias expulsas das suas casas e que precisam viver precariamente em mundos que não são os seus, ou de indígenas cujas terras foram roubadas e que insistem em existir nas margens das estradas, recusando-se a morrer, ou inversamente, como foi o caso há alguns anos dos Guarani Kaiowá, dizendo que preferem morrer a sair de onde estão, sair da sua terra. Ou, indo ainda mais longe, pensemos em relatos de alguns sobreviventes de uma das situações mais extremas a que humanos já foram submetidos por outros humanos, nos campos de extermínio da Alemanha nazista. Primo Levi, por exemplo, nos falou da esperança dos prisioneiros de, pelo menos, sobreviver ao dia, né? Aquele dia horrível e extenuante, até a hora de poderem deitar de novo nas suas camas esquálidas e sonhar brevemente com as suas famílias e o mundo fora do campo. Um sobrevivente do campo de Treblinka, Philip Müller, que testemunha aparece no filme Shoah, de Claude Lanzmann, disse o seguinte: Estávamos convencidos de que a esperança perdura no homem enquanto vive. Enquanto se vive, não se deve nunca renunciar à esperança. E foi assim que lutamos nessa vida tão dura, dia após dia, semana após semana, mês após mês, ano após ano, com a esperança de que lograríamos, talvez, contra toda esperança, escapar daquele inferno. Foram esses relatos que me fizeram mudar de ideia a propósito desse afeto que, no caso, é a esperança. Mas a esperança de todas essas pessoas, e é nesse sentido que eu estou propondo esse afeto aqui, não precisa ser um sentimento magnânime. Para que alguma coisa se passe, basta um diferencial de esperança que, no fim das contas, podemos definir como qualquer pequena inclinação da alma em direção àquilo que amplia a nossa existência e, portanto, em direção, diria Spinoza, talvez, à alegria. A ausência absoluta desses afetos exprime-se na morte em vida daqueles que nos campos eram chamados muçulmanos, como de tantos outros. E sim, existe um medo também, que paralisa e que mata, como já dissemos. Mas consideremos, alguns pensadores, sobretudo durante os piores períodos da Guerra Fria, quando se temia, de fato, e era muito provável um apocalipse nuclear, né? Estou pensando aqui em Gunther Anders e em Hans Jonas, tomaram o medo como um afeto profilático, necessário, fundamental mesmo, o único que seria capaz de nos sensibilizar e nos tirar do estado de paralisia, dando-nos alguma chance, não de anular, mas de adiar, literalmente nesse caso, o fim do mundo. Gunther Anders tem uma bela expressão para esse afeto. Ele fala no medo amoroso, que não é aquele medo que nos leva para os abrigos, mas o que nos leva às ruas, o medo pelos outros e pelas próximas gerações, ou pelas gerações que já estão aí. O medo coletivo e político, o que é também uma maneira de nos reapropriarmos desse afeto que nos tem sido tomado pela direita fascista ou pelo capitalismo neoliberal, simplesmente. É claro que esses dois autores, sobretudo Anders, estão pensando num fim do mundo muito mais abrupto que aquele que nos ameaça hoje. A imagem que ele tem em mente é a de uma guerra nuclear total, que traria o fim absoluto da espécie humana e, com ela, o fim da história, e também o fim do mundo e do próprio ser como tal. Hoje estamos vivendo um fim do mundo relativamente bem mais lento, e talvez seja isso que nos permite ainda pensar que se trata de uma escolha ética, aquela entre assustar e não assustar, deprimir ou não deprimir, dosar as palavras ou dizer toda a verdade. Eu creio que dois acontecimentos na última década imprimiram uma espécie de inflexão nessa ideia de que não se deve assustar. O primeiro foi o movimento de jovens ativistas pelo clima, dentre os quais a agora bem conhecida sueca Greta Thunberg, que afirmou: "Eu não quero que vocês tenham esperança, quero que entrem em pânico, quero que sintam o medo que eu sinto todos os dias, e então quero que vocês tomem uma atitude, quero que ajam como fariam numa crise, que ajam como se a sua casa estivesse em chamas, porque está." Isso foi dito em 2019 no Fórum Econômico Mundial. Ora, quando crianças e jovens dizem que estão com medo e que é preciso ter medo, quem somos nós, entre aspas, né, para dizer que precisamos dosar nossas palavras? Mas a crítica não diz respeito apenas ao afeto que podemos ou devemos gerar nos outros, ela recai também sobre os nossos próprios sentimentos, como se ter medo ou, alternativamente, ter esperança expressasse uma espécie de fraqueza moral. E então veio, creio, o segundo acontecimento, a pandemia do novo coronavírus, a Covid-19. Ela chegou com cenas terríveis de Wuhan, com alertas da OMS, com o fechamento do espaço aéreo para pessoas vindas da China. Chegou também cheia de adversativos, que não era tão grave nem tão contagiosa quanto o sarampo, que usar máscara escondia a coisa mais humana, que é o rosto. E, sobretudo, nos Estados Unidos e aqui, chegou juntamente com a política de negação ativa por parte do governo. Nós todos conhecemos a frase: é só uma gripezinha, vai matar algumas pessoas mais velhas, mas e daí? É a vida. Mas, rapidamente, nós aprendemos que, para proteger a nós e aos outros, era preciso ter, bom, antes de tudo, empatia, mas também medo. Medo de contaminar os próximos, medo de adoecer e de morrer sem assistência nos hospitais públicos. Dia após dia, Conforme o número de vítimas foi aumentando, epidemiologistas e outros médicos e cientistas vieram a público com fatos, projeções e apelos assustadores. Quem não tem medo, ou ao menos finge não ter, é Bolsonaro. E falando em Bolsonaro, então, eu queria terminar com uma ou duas palavras sobre o negacionismo, que é, na verdade, o tema da mesa, e eu fiz essa, torção aqui, antes de entrar no negacionismo, mas rapidamente. Como já se sabe amplamente e está fartamente documentado, o grosso do negacionismo do aquecimento global e da emergência climática é fruto de uma estratégia de décadas, pesadamente financiada pelas grandes empresas de combustíveis fósseis. Assim como o negacionismo do vínculo causal, epidêmico, do tabaco com o câncer, por exemplo, que tinha sido financiado pelas indústrias de tabaco. Esse negacionismo não é exatamente um sentimento nem um estado de espírito, é a mentira como estratégia de governo e de criação de caos, ainda que, para se tornar efetivo, essa mentira precisa encontrar do outro lado uma espécie de desejo ou pulsão de morte. Há também um outro negacionismo, que é aquele que é, por assim dizer, espontâneo, talvez, aliás, muito mais difícil de entender, porque tem muitas causas e assume formas muito diferentes. A psicanálise já descreve, né, além da famosa negação, Verneinung, do Freud, o recalque, o desmentido, a recusa, a faraclusão, e etc. E eu estou convencida de que cada uma dessas formas estruturais do funcionamento psíquico encontra o seu lugar no fenômeno geral da negação. Mas a esse conjunto, talvez nós possamos dar o nome geral de denegação, ao invés de negacionismo. O termo negacionismo foi criado pelo historiador francês Henri Rousseau em 1987 para se referir aos chamados revisionistas da história da Shoah ou Holocausto, dizendo que não havia provas ou que o número de assassinados, 6 milhões, era exagerado, por baixo, né? Que as câmaras de gás não eram câmaras de gás, que Hitler tinha boas intenções, whatever. É verdade que, ao contrário do negacionismo do Holocausto, o do aquecimento global diz respeito a algo que está acontecendo agora no presente e que vai continuar cada vez mais fortemente no futuro. Mas nos dois casos existe uma negação dos fatos e evidências, e principalmente quando se trata do negacionismo por interesses financeiros ou políticos, isso é acompanhado da criação de fatos falsos, de ataques e acusações a supostos inimigos, a minorias, aos cientistas, além da criação artificial junto à opinião pública da percepção de que ainda existe dúvida entre os especialistas. Enfim, tudo isso argumentos muito conhecidos nossos. O terrível, o que dá medo e até pavor, é que esse fenômeno tomou uma dimensão avassaladora e mortífera no Brasil com a eleição de Bolsonaro. Esse governo reúne, para nossa desgraça, tudo isso ao mesmo tempo. Nesses 2 últimos anos, já ouvimos negação do aquecimento global, dos desmatamentos e incêndios recordes na Amazônia, da gravidade da pandemia, da necessidade de usar máscaras e de se distanciar, da segurança das vacinas, da ditadura, da tortura e das mortes pela ditadura. Já ouvimos que quem pôs fogo na Amazônia foram os ambientalistas e que esse governo vem defendendo o meio ambiente como nenhum outro. Já ouvimos até que a Terra é plana. Ouvimos também que o nazismo era de esquerda, ao mesmo tempo que um secretário de Cultura, Roberto Alvim, fez um discurso inspirado no discurso do ministro de propaganda de Hitler, o temível nazista Goebbels. Então, o círculo parece quase se fechar, né, ou querer se fechar, né, inclusive por um detalhe importantíssimo que é a falta de sentido. Falou-se muito sobre a aparente falta de sentido do Holocausto, sobre a dificuldade dos próprios prisioneiros dos campos de extermínio entenderem o que estava acontecendo com eles ali, entenderem a razão das ordens complicadíssimas, da proibição de certas palavras dentro do campo, das informações falsas, do engano proposital, das maldades inúteis. E isso é um pouco o que está acontecendo no governo Bolsonaro, gerando, além de tantas mortes, muita tristeza e desespero. Ninguém entende muito bem, né? Todos tentam explicar, né, todos nós, né, tentamos explicar os interesses por trás das ações e dos discursos. O que se passa, será, né, o que se passa na cabeça do Bolsonaro? Podemos encontrar alguma luz se investigarmos a sua vida prévia? Serão suas alianças? Será falta de capacidade? Será ignorância? Será pura maldade, perversidade? Será tudo isso parte de um plano para armar a população e implantar uma ditadura miliciana? Qual o papel oculto dos Estados Unidos de Trump na eleição de Bolsonaro? Muitas hipóteses, e excelentes até, têm surgido, mas o sentido me parece sempre parcial, porque sempre há uma ponta que não fecha, sempre se trata, e isso creio eu, porque nós estamos diante de uma monstruosidade. Nestes últimos anos aqui no Brasil, nós, como em outras partes do mundo, aliás, parece que submergimos não só na negação e no negacionismo, mas no próprio desejo de morte e de extermínio, a um só tempo, do sentido e de qualquer forma de alteridade, que é a mola propulsora de todo o fascismo. Por isso, talvez a única hipótese que realmente faça sentido é a de alguns juristas brasileiros que estão, nesse momento, trabalhando com evidências muito fortes para provar que Bolsonaro está cometendo um crime contra a humanidade, um crime de extermínio, ou mesmo, talvez, de genocídio, com intenção, plano e ataque sistemático, como se diz. Será que isso fecha o círculo? A vida psíquica de nós todos, sob essa monstruosidade, requereria uma longa análise, mas, evidentemente, eu tenho que terminar aqui, porque já me estendi demais, e esse assunto, infelizmente, vai longe ainda. Obrigada.
Muito obrigada, Débora. Muito obrigada por compartilhar com a gente essa análise muito complexa, né, sobre as armadilhas e as promessas da esperança e do medo, esses afetos tão poderosos no contexto atual, e sobre esse extermínio da alteridade do sentido nesse governo Bolsonaro. So thank you, Deborah. Now we will listen from a second speaker, and let me just a moment. Peraí, vocês estão ouvindo também a intérprete? Não? Ah, bom. Enfim, só para lembrar, pessoal, vocês podem colocar... Gente, eu tô com um problema, eu tô ouvindo...
Você deve estar com o canal... Você está com o canal...
Já vi o que aconteceu. Desculpa, gente. Só para lembrar que vocês podem colocar suas perguntas aqui no chat. Quem está assistindo no YouTube pode colocar lá também, que a gente vai coletar. Okay, so let's proceed, and let me remind you that you can post your questions here on chat or on YouTube in case you're watching us there. So now, after this great talk by Deborah Danovsky, we'll hear from our second speaker, who is Françoise Verger. She was with us on Monday, but in case you were not here, I would like to introduce her again. She's an active teacher, scholar, and curator. She's a specialist in post-colonial studies. She has been chair of the Global South at the Collège d'Études Mondiales in Paris. Currently, she's the president of the collective Decolonize the Arts, and her areas of research are post-colonial studies, South-South exchanges, coloniality, and feminism. She has published many works and articles in French and in English on slavery remembrance, colonial psychiatry, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, the economy of predation and globalization. Also on the post-colonial museum and the processes of creolization in Indian Ocean communities. She's the author of The Wombs of Women, recently translated into English and published by Duke University Press in 2020, and Feminismo Decolonial, a translation of a decolonial feminism published by Ubu Editora. She's also the author of documentary films on Maryse Condé and Aimé Césaire, and she was project advisor for Document 11 in 2002 and the Triennale de Paris in 2011. So thank you, Françoise, for joining us again, and we're excited to hear from you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And sorry for, getting late. It just reminds us that digital is just digital, right? Okay, so my talk will be a little shorter. I was thinking, about the growing number of film and TV series that depict catastrophe, the end of the world dominated by alien and living dead, saved either by superhuman avengers or lone heroes and heroines, and what kind of imaginary this film and TV series offered. To engage this, I want to talk about two films that, were, quite historical at the moment, when they were released, sorry. In 1968, George Romero released The Night of the Living Dead, the script. Sibling Barbara and Johnny drive to a cemetery in rural Pennsylvania to visit their father's grave. Their car radios goes off the air due to technical difficulties. As they are leaving the cemetery, a strange, ashen-faced man wearing a tattered suit kills Johnny and attacks Barbara. She flees and takes shelter in a farmhouse, but finds the woman who lived there dead and half-eaten. She sees a multiplying number of strange living dead led by the man from the cemetery approaching the house. A black man arrives. His name is Ben. He secures the farmhouse by boarding the windows and doors and drives away the living dead with a gun. Two men emerge from the cellar. One has been taken shelter there with his wife Ellen and their young daughter Karen after a group of the same monsters overturned their car and beat Karen, leaving her seriously ill. The other has arrived with his girlfriend Judy after hearing an emergency broadcast about a series of brutal killings all over the United States. Tom heads Ben in securing the farmhouse, while Harry angrily protests that it is unsafe before returning to the cellar, which is believed is safer. Living dead continue to besiege the farmhouse in ever-increasing number. The refugees listen to radio and television report of a wave of mass murder across the United States. And now I cut to the end. As the horde of living dead break finally into the house and really threaten, and most of the people are dead or they have been eating each other, Ben takes refuge in the cellar, where he shoots Harry and Ellen reanimating corpses because Harry and Ellen themselves has become living dead. The next morning, a group of white armed men arrives and they kill all the remaining dead. Awakened by gunfire and siren, Ben, the black man, emerged from the cellar, but is shot and killed because this man mistook him for a living dead. His body is then thrown off onto a bonfire and burned with the rest of the living dead. In an interview, Romero explained that to him, the original story was about how people respond or fail to respond to reality. There is this global change, he said about the film, and there is this one guy, Ben, the black character, holding out saying, wait a minute, I'm still a human. He is wrong. Go ahead, join them, and you will live forever. In a certain sense, Romero went on, is wrong, but on the other hand, you got to respect him for taking that position. The fact that the black man was the only one to fully understand the threat, but also was the only one killed by a group of human, white, but human, is speaking volume. The narrative of the catastrophe was already heavily gendered and racialized, and we could discuss also many of the tropes. Now I move to another film in 1996, Independence Day. It was a huge success. It delighted the public with its depiction of alien invaders, reducing the White House to an inferno. President Bill Clinton and presidential candidate Bob Dole both endorsed the film breathlessly. We won in the end, said Dole. Bring your family, you will be proud of it. Diversity, America, leadership, good over evil. Unquote. How did such an apocalyptic and ultra-violent film manage to achieve this kind of acclaim? In a short and incisive text, Michael Rogan suggested that Independence Day was serving American power in the name of attacking it. As Dieter Felber had shown, Rogan took seriously the precept that science fiction entertainment capture the bewildering signal of the present and beam them back to us in condensed allegorical forms. Drawing from Marx and Freud, Rogan saw Independence Day as recreating the imagined community of the American nation, North American nation, pursuing a project of reassurance, redemption, rebirth, and restoration of innocence. The film reimagined American society and rewrote American history. Propaganda disguised as escapism. Independence Day saved American anxiety about race, sexuality, disease, and war by means of a delirious movie making. Roggin showed how the depiction of interracial friendship was imagined to, I quote, magically heal America's systemic racial inequalities. He analyzed the scene where the two heroes, it's one Jewish man and one Black man, penetrate the alien mother ship, which embodies the monstrous feminine, then emerge from the contracting vagina dentata, that is, that to enter the ship, before triumphantly rejoining their wives on Earth as they smoke a phallic victory cigar, while debris from the nuke mothership fall like firework. And Roggin said, this ally anal penetration with death, escape maternal power, and rescue heterosexuality. So gay sex via homophobia, husband and wives, and nuclear bomb, all this silence was able to destroy the threat of a maternal whose fetus-like progeny added to the monstrous. Last Monday, I spoke of the intense pleasure that the death drive gives. Destruction offers intensity, the blowing work of entire city, their monument engulfed in flames, the erasure of half of the humanity, quite often summarized in a sentence like, after a terrible catastrophe, only some group of humans survive, as if none of this matter. There is no mourning, never. Destruction is sublime, resistance is possible, it's the release of so many anxiety. With these two examples, I wanted to signal how the scenario of planetary destruction answer to masculine anxiety, disavowal of the maternal, denial of racial inequality and injustices. Has the integration recently of non-white characters changed something in this scenario? Not really. The solution out of the catastrophe remains in the hand of leaders, strong leaders, and catastrophes are always caused by something outside of social forces, outside of capitalism, outside of racism and sexism. It happened. Humanity is presented as whole. Even those studies have shown that already those who suffer the most now of the, not tomorrow, but now of the climate crisis are people of the global south, and among them women. Indeed, in a recent studies, two researchers show, and I quote, that natural disaster lower the life expectancy of women more than that of men. In other words, natural disaster and their subsequent impact on average kill more women than men, or kill women at an earlier age than men. Since female life expectancy is generally higher than that of male, for most countries, natural disaster narrow the gender gap in life expectancy. Second, the stronger the disaster, the stronger this effect on the gender gap. That is, major calamities lead to more severe impact on female life expectancy than do smaller disasters. Third, the higher woman's socioeconomic status, the weaker is this effect on the gender gap life expectancy. So we do see that effectively women, and this is, I don't think, a detail, will in the global south are already suffering and will suffer even more from this famous catastrophe. And of course, class will save some of them. Can we really be clearer about what we are witnessing? Hubris, the belief in man's capacity to overcome catastrophe, the denial of the long history of catastrophe feed the scenario of planetary destruction. I was thinking as I was, reading about this denial, I was looking at the denial. I was thinking of what Lacan said about the neurotic. I don't know if you know that, he say that it's like someone who has all his baggage ready, he's at the door of his apartment, he's ready for a long journey, and he remains stuck there, he never leaves, he remains stuck in the entry with his luggage, he's hesitate forever. But as, someone will say, but what are you doing? Are you not going, for your journey? Your luggage are ready. He disavows this situation. And because he knows nothing about why he can't leave his apartment, or that he has no responsibility in that fact, no connection to it. So he's there, but he will never, do something about it. It's always other than the obstacle. Someone, it's not him, it's not inside. And the other in the planetary catastrophe scenario that, this is happening, but what can, I see, I have all the luggage, but I'm not leaving. But the other in this scenario, the other in that, neurotic scenario is humanity, rather than racism, capitalism, rather than the unsatisfied and satiated desire for mastering everything that is tied with digital, technical, engineering, capitalism. There is then a contempt for humanity, unable to react. Why are they doing? A lament even. And perhaps not far from there, the idea of a civilizing mission that we need to show them, we need to educate them about the planetary catastrophe. When planetary catastrophe is constructed as inevitable, it colonizes the imagination. We are no longer able to imagine anything else. This is going to happen to us. But catastrophe has long been the norm of racial capitalism. And it has taught us also, I'm trying to know what time I'm doing, sorry. And it has taught us no longer see what is under our eyes, no longer even comprehend what we see. It's not that it's hidden, it's there, I do not see what I'm being shown mean. I don't know what that means. I see it, but I don't know. And we do know, that happened in Rwanda, people saying, and they did not comprehend. You don't necessarily comprehend. It's not, the facts are not enough to comprehend what we see. We have endless image of destruction, endless image of, polluted sea, polluted river, polluted cities, polluted, pandemic, catastrophe, hurricane, flood, earthquake, that are more and more famine and all this. And they have no longer a meaning. They do not connect us with something. In fact, as Jean Baudrillard noted in his book, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. Indeed, the war did not take place because, and I quote, all that is singular and irreducible must be reduced and absorbed. This is a law of democracy and the New World Order. In this sense, the Iran-Iraq war was a successful first phase. Iraq served to liquidate the most radical form of the anti-Western challenge, even though he never defeated it. So this is what effectively, this is not taking place. The destruction is not taking place. It's not because it's taking place that it is taking place. There is an impossible relationship between psychic reality and the real linked to loss. There is an impossibility to see what is in fact being shown. We cannot say that capitalism is hiding the destruction it is, doing. In a work I'm doing with the artist Kaderatia, we address, in fact, the question of irreparable. What we're going to do with the destruction that is already there. And in fact, the irreparable, because the destruction, of course, there is this destruction, but we are also dealing with the accumulated level of toxic waste and debris from slavery to today. Are all the damage reparable? And then how do we think repair? How do we think that, the way we will go out of this situation? Fear does not automatically mobilize, nor the idea of threat. The task of cleaning the mess seems impossible, so why should we start? And even, the idea that we have survived until now, why should we, we will survive. Reasoning does not seem either to affect anything. We saw it even again the pandemic, and the preceding speaker talked about that. We are in fact reading every day how it's devastating entire society. We saw it in Brazil, as we heard, but also in India. And the government look elsewhere. There is no scandal. There is no real scandal. There is no mobilization. Should we not resort then to violence? Andreas Malm, has advocated blowing up the oil pipeline, because he said that we should be doing at one point, Or should we wait for the catastrophe? That finally enough people are fed up, that enough, are wake up from fear and use their anger to act. What about anger as a feeling, as an effect? Is not collective anger good when it leads to action and to empathy, the kind that Octavia Butler explores in her novel of, After Catastrophe, because she really showed the catastrophe. The denial of weapons of mass destruction that are now more than ever effective has a long history. Why should I imagine my death, my own death? It will happen to someone else. Is it possible for me to imagine my disparity, my death? Why should I not trust life energy? The energy and love for life that in fact I also observe every day among the young migrants, who overcome so many obstacles, so many threats, so many deaths. It's not a philosophy of love for life that is always fragile that we should think about. A fragility that requires interconnection, transgenerational connection. A fragility that goes everything masculinistic capitalist ideology defined. What does a newborn needs, if not affection and love and touch? We always speak as adults about what we are saying, as if we were born full adult. We never speak of the catastrophe from the point of view of a newborn. We speak of the catastrophe as people who can already run, who know where to hide, who will know how to steal to survive. But what about a little human being? We know, through the work of Winnicott and Bowlby and other, child psychologists, that children separated, that newborns separated from human, from the touch, from the warmth, not just, and the love, not just, being fed, will die. They will not survive. So how to effectively, to go against the fact that the men who create and deny planetary destruction deny with all their energy this fact that without interconnection and without love and touch, we die. How effectively, perhaps, to start from this fragility, and I'm not talking about resilience and fragility, I'm talking about effectively the looking at planetary catastrophe from the point of view of the human being who needs most love and touch to survive, and who is effectively the newborn, and how love and touch and affection and intergenerational connection will be needed to overcome planetary destruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Françoise, for this very fascinating talk in which you foreground the gender racial dimensions of our current predicament and of the role of capitalism and anger and fragility and violence. Thank you for showing to us in such a beautiful way that we are not all in this together. Thank you very much. So now I will, we have our final speaker, who is Robert Fletcher. So I'd like to introduce him. Robert Fletcher is an environmental anthropologist based at the Sociology, Development and Change Group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, has been involved in research projects on convivial conservation, tourism and degrowth, cultural dimensions of ecotourism, Conservation and Development in Costa Rica, Neoliberalization of Environmental Governance, and Environmental Resistance and Social Movements. His many publications include the books Conservation Revolution, Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene, co-authored with Bram Buescher and published by Verso Books in 2020, and Romance in the Wild, Cultural Dimensions of Ecotourism, published by Duke University Press in 2014. He has also co-edited the books The Eco Laboratory, Environmental Governance and Economic Development in Costa Rica, and Tourism and Degrowth, Towards a Truly Sustainable Tourism, both published last year, and Nature TM Inc., Environmental Conservation in the Neoliberal Age, published in 2014. So thank you very much, Robert. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's very nice to be part of this discussion. I'm going to share my screen here to pull up a PowerPoint that I prepared. I think this is viewable now. So this talk builds on previous work I've done, but directly refers to a new book manuscript that's currently under review right now. I call this talk then Sustainable Fantasies, the Sustainable Development Goals versus the End of the World, but it could just as easily be called The End of Capitalism versus the End of the World. And of course, this builds on the famous quotation from Frederick Jameson, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism." But increasingly now, it is becoming increasingly possible to imagine the end of capitalism, or at least people are talking about it that way. So we have critics like Zizek making the claim that the global capitalist system is approaching an apocalyptic zero point. On the other hand, you also have very mainstream commentators like U2 frontman turned development pundit Bono, also making the argument, the assertion that capitalism is going up on trial. And I think that it's clear that putting profit before people is a non-sustainable business model. In the realm of sustainable development, this entire discussion has always been haunted, in a sense, by the question of limits to growth, and especially the implications of this for a capitalist system that, at least according to some people, operates according to what's been called the God principle, grow or die. And so paraphrasing Zizek, you could argue that from the perspective of capitalism, sustainability is an illusion, and the increase in CO2 and other environmental impacts are its symptom. And this is essentially the argument that's being increasingly made by proponents of degrowth, among others, with the argument that sustainability is only possible by pursuing some form of post-capitalist economic alternative. But of course, this is denied by most mainstream commentators under a variety of labels, many of which revolve around this idea of the green economy, that essentially assert that it's possible to reconcile sustained economic growth and sustainability by essentially making sustainability the basis for economic growth. And this is reflected in a variety of images like these, where you actually see money growing out of the environment and vice versa. And studying these so-called market-based mechanisms has been a big part of my recent work. The latest iteration of this strategy is contained within the newly implemented Sustainable Development Goals that have at their heart the idea of decoupling, which is defined as the potential to divorce economic growth for environmental impacts. Decoupling is not actually within the Sustainable Development Goals itself, but you can find this in a wide range of commentary all about how to implement the goals, from the former director of UNEP to the former Secretary General of the United Nations, to Jeffrey Sachs, one of the main academic contributors to formulating the goals, to the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that Jeffrey Sachs, among others, put up to help guide implementation of the goals, and many other sources, to the point that it might not be too hyperbolic to argue that decoupling could be the master signifier that holds the Sustainable Development Goals together, despite the fact that it's somewhat of a covert concept. And so I wanted to delve into it a bit more here. The decoupling proposal is most elaborately outlined in a series of reports produced by UNEP. And one of the authors of these reports, states without overemphasis that from his perspective, staying within planetary boundaries is essentially impossible without degrowth, without decoupling. It's that important. So what is decoupling? Well, the analysis that UNEP outlines relies on a series of distinctions. And the first is between relative and absolute decoupling. And so relative decoupling is where economic activity increases, as does resource use, but resource use increases at a lower rate than economic activity. So there's increasingly a gap between the amount of resources that are employed to develop economic value. Absolute decoupling is when economic activity increases, but resource use actually decreases overall. And the aim then of decoupling is to move from relative decoupling to absolute decoupling. And that's where we get closer to sustainability in this analysis. So relative versus absolute decoupling. The second distinction is between material and immaterial resources. Material resources are, of course, obvious. Immaterial resources, one of the examples UNEP uses is the song of a bird, which gives us value in some form or another, but doesn't actually use any actual resources. The third set of distinctions is between economic and physical growth. Economic growth is, of course, increase in value, and physical growth is the actual expansion of material use and impacts on space. Okay. So, based on all of these distinctions, the analysis that UNEP makes is essentially what decoupling is trying to pursue is what they call dematerialization. And they define that as a shift into sustainable development whereby improvements in well-being are achieved via non-material economic growth. So that's the promise of this agenda. And what they argue is if you actually look at the history of the world, what you can see is evidence that that decoupling to a certain extent has actually been happening, because we can see that global GDP has grown faster over time than resource use. And they see this as evidence that decoupling is possible. But they go even further, building on this, to make this very profound argument, building on another ecological economist, Ekins, who argues that it is clear from past experience that the relationship between the economy's value and its physical scale is variable, and that it is possible to reduce the material intensity of GNP. This establishes the theoretical possibility of GNP growing indefinitely in a finite material world. So this is quite profound. And so my argument is essentially that via decoupling, the Sustainable Development Goals counter these age-old concerns about the potential biophysical limits to economic growth with the idea that via decoupling, economic growth is sustainable infinitely. A very profound argument, and it's used directly to counter arguments from people such as degrowth proponents that argue, in fact, the opposite, right? That essentially we need to move away from a growth-based economy altogether. On the other hand, after outlining this decoupling scenario and asserting it in very strong terms, then UNEP goes on to essentially undermine the basis for its own proposal. Okay? To begin, the reports then point out that there is actually virtually no evidence that decoupling actually works, that it has happened, and especially no absolute decoupling. They argue there is some evidence for relative decoupling, but ultimately, for sustainability to occur, we need absolute decoupling, and there is virtually no evidence that this has ever been achieved. Second, they acknowledge that even the conceptual basis for imagining decoupling is quite weak. And third, that even if it were possible, it would be politically infeasible. And going further, you could make the claim that the evidence that they interpret as decoupling, as the possibility of dematerialization, actually refers to dramatically and accelerating resource use without end. So they interpret dramatically increasing resource impacts and use as evidence of the opposite decoupling. So based on all of this, obviously, many critics have been very skeptical of proposals like this, and the decoupling proponents are sensitive to this, and at least some of them who are part of this Sustainable Development Solutions Network, led by Jeffrey Sachs, respond in this way. There are many pessimists regarding decoupling who feel that the only way to limit resource use is to limit overall economic growth. We disagree. Decoupling has not yet been tried as a serious global strategy. So essentially what this does is push off criticism of this possibility and also of the potential of biophysical limits to economic growth into the distant future once the Sustainable Development Goals have been tried. And according to many environmentalists, many critics of this perspective, of course, by that time comes, we essentially have already run out of time. All right, so if we could, on the surface, see the Sustainable Development Goals as promoting fantasies of sustainability, we could also make the opposite argument that they're also sustainable fantasies in the sense they push off into some distant future the actual confronting of the limits that otherwise we'd be required to address right here and right now. And so then you go further to argue that they, like many other attempts to address environmental problems within capitalist terms, embody this logic of disavowal that Zizek characterizes as holding that the situation is catastrophic but not serious. And I think this is a really useful way to think about a lot of these mainstream approaches to dealing with the situation they have right now. On the surface, right, in a classic form of disavowal, they recognize that what is at stake here is in fact the future of the world. But the ways that they're going about addressing it are nowhere near matched to the scale of the problem or addressing the actual root causes of the problem that others have pointed to, and as a result go on treating the situation as it's not serious in ways that previous speakers have also spoken about. And ultimately then, you can make the argument that what all of this does is create a form of ideological obfuscation for the fact that capitalism more and more is in a death spiral, right? Pursuing this phase of death drive, where the movement shifts to a form of self-destructive movement without end and without regard to its consequences. And of course, from a psychoanalytic perspective, one of the reasons for the move into drive is the inability to mourn for a loss, right? That causes instead the repetition of failure to achieve the object and resulting in a form of melancholia, right? And so this is, I think, one of the main reasons that people, Zizek, argue that ideology is not simply imposed on ourselves, right? We enjoy our ideology. To step out of ideology, it hurts. It's a painful experience. You must force yourself to do it, right? And so then the big question then becomes, what is it that could motivate us to confront the pain of loss of attachment to a capitalist society that provides various forms of at least pseudo-enjoyment, okay? Confront the pain of loss of attachment in order to produce something else. And I see one of the biggest obstacles in the fact that, as previous speakers have described, most of the images we have of a radically different future are quite apocalyptic, right? Quite negative. They're not the kind of things that are likely to motivate you to voluntarily pursue them, right? In fact, quite the opposite. They're going to motivate you, right, through the negative associations to blindly hold on to what you have right now, regardless of the consequences of moving towards there. So I see one of the main challenges in moving forward to try to replace this with other images, right? Other images that are post-phantasmatic, that provide for the possibility of post-phantasmatic enjoyment that could potentially motivate us to be willing to undergo the pain of loss of attachment to the world that we're in right now, and actually be motivated to pursue something different and to confront the disavowal of our unconscious desire to resist the change that on the surface many of us claim we want to pursue. And that's what I have to present to you today. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think we can all agree that it's been an amazing panel. Thank you so much for showing to us the fantasies and disavowals of our most important international institutions, such as the UN, which is something that generates a lot of anger, at least in me, but also of pointing out, well, some form of way out, the importance of other images and imaginaries to help us confront the pain of giving up our attachments on capitalism and its promises. Thank you very much, Robert. So, okay. I muted myself for some reason, I don't know why. Okay, so we already have a few questions here. We have 3 questions for Deborah, one question for Francois, and one question for the whole panel so far. So I think I'll pose these 5 questions now, and then we can go to another round. Is that all right? So, okay, to Deborah, I'll read in Portuguese, and then our interpreters can translate them to English, so our other panelists can understand the questions as well. So, Manuela para Débora. Débora, na mesa de ontem, falou-se sobre um dos efeitos do capitalismo, a produção do capitalismo na sua configuração neoliberal, né? Essa produção de sujeitos antissociais. Como você conectaria sua reflexão sobre esperança a uma crítica de nossa sociabilidade no capitalismo? Agora, outra pergunta para a Débora, da Gabriela Aparecida. Emendando com o comentário da Manuela, li há um tempo um artigo que falava sobre o uso de um termo alternativo para antropoceno, que seria capitaloceno, para desvincular as atuais catástrofes ambientais da espécie humana em si, ou em geral, né? Enfim, sem entender a natureza humana como propensa à devastação, e para enfatizar a responsabilidade do sistema capitalista nisso tudo. O que você acha desse termo, capitaloceno? E agora, da Gabriela Nascimento, para Débora. Muitos observam que essa visão positiva do neoliberalismo está em crise. Dentro disso, alguns teóricos consideram que antes o tempo era portador da esperança, trazendo o efeito calmante de evolução e de desenvolvimento. Hoje parece que o futuro praticamente desapareceu, ou é visto com um imenso pessimismo. Uma nova noção de temporalidade negativou o futuro e, junto a isso, surgem movimentos fascistas e conservadores. O Covid intensifica isso? Como podemos caminhar a uma visão utópica de uma outra ordem possível, mais otimista? Quais são os nossos entraves? O que você acha desse debate de uma crise de temporalidade nos dias de hoje? Então, essas foram as 3 perguntas para a Débora. Para François...
tá bom.
Não, mas pode responder, depois eu faço.
Não sei, o que você prefere?
Pode fazer, pode responder, aí depois eu faço para a François.
Tá, é para não esquecer.
Tá bom, tá bom.
Eu queria começar por essa última, tentar ser rápido, porque eu já falei demais, né? Eu acho que sim, existe uma crise de temporalidade, com o rompimento, né, que alguns autores, historiadores, inclusive, já observaram, que assim, nós estamos nos dando conta de que o passado não serve mais para nós projetarmos o futuro, né? E aparece no nosso horizonte como uma possibilidade, não necessariamente, é claro que é uma questão importante, essa possibilidade vai se realizar com esse tipo e não outro tipo de catástrofe, se ela vai ser maior, se vai ser menor, não importa que o efeito sobre a nossa concepção de temporalidade é essa de um rompimento justamente do caminho da ideia de que a gente ia caminhando sempre para o futuro, passado para o futuro, né? Subindo, foi um pouco que eu falei no meu texto, né? Subindo em termos de progresso, luzes, o que quer que seja, né? Agora, essa ideia de que no final nós seremos capazes de substituir a nossa penúria ou a nossa desgraça, ou seja o que for, presente, por um estado melhor, né, que eu acho que isso que você mencionou sobre a possibilidade de instauração de uma nova ordem diferente, isso faz parte da concepção moderna de temporalidade, né? Não é, digamos assim, talvez sair, talvez, não vou dizer aproveitar, porque eu não acredito nessa ideia de oportunidades criadas pela crise, ou de, né, isso vai trazer alguma coisa de bom, não é bem isso, mas nós estamos num momento de ruptura de tal ordem, de vários níveis, vários graus, várias modalidades, que talvez a única saída seja justamente tentar pensar, não em termos temporais, mas ou dentro de um tipo de temporalidade que não se conforme mais a essa temporalidade única, né, unidimensional, em que nós abandonamos um passado, né, e estamos caminhando para um futuro com o qual todos concordam, que todos desejam, que, né, isso não vai existir. Né? É impossível que exista, e aí eu acho que realmente é impossível que exista. O que pode talvez existir é a gente se inspirar em outras concepções, ou podemos não nos inspirar, mas isso não vai nos trazer nada de bom, né? Outras concepções de ordem social, econômica, de subjetividade, de tudo, né, que não pensam dessa maneira, que têm outras ideias de temporalidade. Então, eu concordo parcialmente com... Eu não consegui anotar essa... Eu não estou vendo aqui na minha frente. Essa... já vi. Uma nova noção de temporalidade negativou o futuro, né? Eu acho que o contrário, assim, a perspectiva de ausência do futuro é que chacoalhou, fez estremecer essa noção de temporalidade que está ligada com a religião judaico-cristã, com todo esse... Tem uma história que, aliás, pode começar, talvez comece lá na era axial, muito antes do que a instauração da própria modernidade, né? Mas que, aparentemente, a gente não consegue pensar fora, só que a gente, por mais que a gente não consiga pensar fora desse esquema, né, do capitalismo, nós estamos sendo obrigados a conviver com essa sensação de ruptura, né? Então, bom, enfim, para falar rápido e não demorar muito, capitaloceno, sim, o capitaloceno é um dos nomes alternativos. Eu acho que antropoceno é o nome dado pelos geólogos, que praticamente já está aceito dentro da comunidade dessa ciência, embora não se saiba exatamente o ponto de começo, não se tenha chegado a um acordo sobre o momento, quase, né? Provavelmente vai ser na época do pós-guerra, o início do antropoceno. Mas o antropoceno conta histórias e, digamos assim, é a nossa fonte de informação nesse momento, talvez maior, sobre o que está acontecendo, mas eu gosto muito de uma frase da Donna Haraway, eu sempre repito quando me perguntam alguma coisa parecida com essa, né? Em que ela diz que cada um desses nomes conta uma história diferente, né? E a gente não tem que excluir um nome em favor de outro, né? Não, mesmo que a gente queira, aliás, né? Nós não vamos conseguir excluir o nome antropoceno. Ele diz uma série de coisas que são importantes para a gente hoje. Capitaloceno conta uma outra história diferente do antropoceno, né? Por exemplo, conta a história de que existe uma diferença entre a destruição causada por países do norte e países do sul, conta uma série de pequenas histórias dentro dessa grande história do capitalismo, né, que são necessários, mas tem outros nomes, quando a Paula acho que mencionou, né, Tanatoceno, Euroceno, existe Gaia também, né, Gaia e a intrusão de Gaia, tem N nomes diferentes, eu acho que todos eles são importantes. Essa pluralidade de nomes, é claro que alguns nomes, por exemplo, bom antropoceno é o nome dos ecomodernistas, não é um nome que eles deem, mas eles falam em um grande antropoceno, né? Nós vamos conseguir, né? Uma grande oportunidade de aproveitar justamente o antropoceno para produzir algo ainda melhor, que é o bom antropoceno, é o grande antropoceno, né? Essas são as pessoas que falam em decoupling, né? Então, tem alguns nomes com os quais eu não concordo, mas tem muitos nomes interessantes, e eu acho que todos eles devem ser motivo de discussão e de motivo no sentido de nós pensarmos a respeito e a partir desses nomes, né? A primeira pergunta, deixa eu ver se eu me lembro, era sobre a produção, um dos efeitos do capitalismo. Eu não assisti essa parte da mesa de ontem, né? Mas a produção, um dos efeitos do capitalismo seria a produção de sujeitos antissociais, né? Eu acho que sim, eu acho que um dos sentidos dos dois afetos que eu falei sobre medo e esperança porque eles têm voltado praticamente todos os dias como tema as pessoas estão muito preocupadas com isso, né? E eu acho que uma das abordagens que eu tentei apresentar sobre o que seria o medo e a esperança são desses afetos como antissociais, justamente, né? A esperança que projeta um futuro que deve ser esperado, né? E que alguém vai, digamos assim, enfim, que vai acontecer, que não depende da minha ação. Esse é um afeto, essa é uma esperança antissocial, eu diria, né? O medo, idem, o medo que nos leva a construir muro, o medo do Trump, o medo do Bolsonaro, embora tenha dito que o Bolsonaro não tinha medo, né, da Covid, mas, digamos assim, medo desses novos populismos de direita, neofascistas, né, neonazistas, etc., ele é um medo individualista, né? É um medo que nos retira da luta e das ruas, né? Mas eu acho que essa não é a única maneira de se compreender esses afetos, e eu acho que as duas outras versões, digamos assim, né? Eu acho que todas elas existem, né? Há modalidades de afetos que convivem, né? Numa determinada população ou em cada pessoa, né? Mas o que eu tentei propor era justamente, digamos assim, afetos, não diria sociais, né? Mas afetos que nos fazem procurar outras pessoas, né? E que é uma coisa que a gente está vendo muito hoje em dia. Enquanto você tem toda a campanha genocida, exterminista, negacionista do Bolsonaro, você tem um outro movimento por parte da sociedade civil, que é da solidariedade, que é da tentativa de formação, mesmo numa situação em que parece impossível formar coletivos e procurar outras pessoas, né? Esses coletivos estão procurando fazer esse movimento, né? Então, isso é o que eu um pouco tinha, não sei se eu respondi a nenhuma das questões, até ter que correr aqui, para deixar os outros falarem.
Obrigada, Débora. Okay, so we have two questions for Françoise and two questions for Robert and another one to Deborah. So I'll ask first the two to Françoise. Is that all right? And one of the questions to you, Françoise, is in Portuguese. I'll read it in Portuguese and our translators will translate it to you, okay? So the first question is: em que medida as artes podem nos ajudar a imaginar e sentir a Terra, the land, né? A Terra no sentido de land, e a Terra, o planeta, de outra maneira, mas sem que através delas nos engajemos essa é da Raquel, sem que através delas nos engajemos em novos projetos de esclarecimento e educação, daqueles que negam, conscientemente ou não, a realidade da catástrofe ecológica. Em suma, como falar sobre sensibilização sem recair no impulso de conscientizar, sem que isso vire uma nova forma de colonialismo. Is that all right, Françoise? Okay, and the second question, so this was from Raquel, and the second question is from Jimmy. To Françoise, you mentioned that racial capitalism depends on and generates catastrophe. Can you explain what you meant by this, especially since many of us in the audience are here in Brazil, a society created by the genocidal expropriation of indigenous peoples and the genocidal exploitation of African peoples? Okay, so these are your two questions.
I'm trying to read again the second question because I did not. Can you explain what you mean by depend on generate? Okay. Sorry. So the first question, if I understood the word, is how do we talk about the reality of the catastrophe, of the question of ecology? What kind of education, what kind of pedagogy would be needed so we don't give lesson to people? I mean, kind of. Okay. Well, again, I will say that the question of it has to really go against the ideology of individualism, that, you know, by myself I can do something, or just, you know, me and my family, because, you know, this is a big ideology. You know, I will save just myself and my family. I mean, the interconnectedness, this is a pedagogy of interconnection, not intersection, of interconnection. Is really that, you know, we can say whatever we want, we will not survive by ourselves. I mean, there's the question. Sorry. Oh God, I don't know where my phone is to stop it. Sorry. Okay, thank you. Sorry. I could not find my phone. This is late in Paris, so people are starting to call. Okay. I mean, this pedagogy, I think it's really a pedagogy, and I think it has it could start at both very small and then grow big, but it has to be really connected to reality, connected to what people really feel right now. I mean, how they understand what's going on. Has to really go, you know, from in a neighborhood, what do we need? How are we going to resolve this question? How do we going to start to have that clean water, clean air? You know, that the garbage is picking up. That is, we don't have rats and bad and building that make children, they cannot breathe anymore. I mean, these are really the concrete question of people's life. I mean, we have to understand what do we need for living, and anyone can understand that, you know, well, effectively my children have asthma, why, what, and the garbage is not being picked up. And so it's not the little gesture. I'm not talking about the colibri, you know, crap here. I'm talking about really collective answer to neighborhood, to concrete question. And the second question, you know, pardon, sorry. What you mean by this? Okay. Well, racial capitalism, yes, when I say it depends on engineered catastrophe, from the beginning, racial capitalism was based on extraction and exhaustion. Extraction in the mine, and extraction then in the plantation, and the exhaustion of the soil, of the riches, and of the bodies of enslaved people or exploited people. Both went together. Extraction and exhaustion. Exhaustion is not just a consequence of extraction, it goes together. I'm absolutely founded on the fact that, for instance, we know with mine, right? The capitalists, even today, right, will mine everything, and then when it's empty, it will go to another one, and will leave behind, you know, that absolutely devastating places, ruined, village ruined, polluted. And this industry, on top of it, breaks a social connection. It's, you know, bring young men, you know, single men quite often. And so it goes with certain economy also of sexual exploitation and rape. I mean, all this is about effectively breaking any form of community, of the possibility of making kinship and connection. So in Brazil, this was also, I mean, we know that it was in the northeast of Brazil that the plantation, the architecture of plantation was perfected, and then traveled to the Caribbean and elsewhere, and even to the Indian Ocean, was perfected in the sense that how do you build a rational architecture that will perfect extraction and exhaustion, and will then justify and legitimize the exhaustion of bodies. And of course, indigenous people will have to go away, or they will be killed. So the racial capitalism goes with devastation and ruin. There is no other possibility. You cannot accumulate wealth the way capitalism need to survive to accumulate waste without that. And it needs that colonization. It needs that effectively, if so many bodies are exhausted, I bring more. I mean, if slave trade lasted for a century, it was because effectively, constantly plantation had to, be effectively fed with new bodies. It was not just we're going to bring some million at one point and then it will reproduce. No, there was this idea that even the source was limitless. That we will always go back, that as they will always go back to Africa and extract more people and leave, a continent devastated and, depopulated. And this continued to this day. There is, it's easy to see how the need for the accumulation is based on exhaustion and extraction. And that capitalism is also the production of waste, not the production only of goods, but needs, leave behind or produce, at least produce goods, leave entire amount, mountain of garbage. And this has had to the pollution and had to the exhaustion of the land, the sea, the river, and the forest and everything. So this understanding of and we say rational. I follow Cedric Robinson and other, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela Davis, and the fact that capitalism does not go without rational formation. There is not capitalism and then racism. It fabricates racialized body. It needs to fabricate racialized body to then legitimate their exploitation. It's not a surprise that finally, for instance, if I do remember by my reading about Brazil, that most women who work as domestic, in the bourgeois home are Black women. And all this construction of who need to, who occupy the lower level of the work organization. And when it's rationalized, it can be rationalized within also the global south. And what I mean by that is, right now, Brazil could be clear among, the white and non-white. But even in India, the process of racialization does not need necessarily a very strong distinction between skin color. You can racialize, you can racialize people. And we know that in Europe, for instance, the first processes of racialization was upon the Jewish people, that it absolutely, and that they were the target of pogrom and discrimination, and they were fabricated as other, as effectively, and then Muslim were fabricated as other, and today, as other that whose life do not matter, whose life can be, effectively disposed of. And the incredible amount of bodies that were disposed of, that could die in mine and in plantation yesterday and today is sometimes the number is the most incredible, and so we kind of forget that the way in which the workforce is conceived as cheap, like nature is conceived as cheap, it's cheap. It will always, replenish itself. There will be always people to exploit, traffic. I look at the way, perhaps this is not the fact in South America, but the way in which migrants are treated in Europe is that, at the same time, they are absolutely criminalized, chased, absolutely harassed, treated in terrible ways. And at the same time, these are the people who will occupy the lower, jobs in European society. They are needed. So this constant fabrication of a dehumanization of people really goes with racial capitalism we need. I think that was the only question. No, that was the second question.
You already answered the first one on how the arts could be important to change the way
the arts. They do. They are extremely important today. There is incredible work, and what we call Afrofuturism is very also important. But I do think, I mean, literature is quite, it's quite amazing also. It's now quite amazing. And film and contemporary art, yes. I mean, this is incredible. And it's not just imagining the future, it's also the present. I mean, the way of thinking the catastrophe is not necessarily about the future, it's the fact that the present is already the future. So it does not take, you know, this tomorrow, it's how today there is a future in the present that we are living. And the future is a practice, is a moment of practice. So it's not just imagining, it's not constantly about tomorrow, it's about today. And that is very strong in this form of activism, futurist activism. It's not just about imagining another world when, you know, everything would be different. It's about today. It's about how today is the future.
Thank you very much, Françoise. Okay, we have less than 10 minutes left and still a lot of questions. There are 3 questions for Robert. I'll read them just for the benefit of our recording, because then the people who watch the recording cannot see on chat. And then we have more questions, but I'm really not sure if we'll be able to talk about them all. So, okay, for Robert Fletcher, the first one is, my point of departure, this is from Isabel. My point of departure is within the realm of critical approaches to development, so to say, but in my own research, I found that the fight for implementing the SDGs, at least here in Brazil, has been presented by civil society leadership, academics, and invested public servants as a fight for rights. They say they are suffocating in the face of the many challenges posed by the federal government, and the SDGs are, in their view, a mirror of our own constitution, and as such, a pragmatic platform to be able to keep fighting on an everyday basis for basic rights. This is vital for them. In that sense, I see a powerful imaginary that has been built alongside a sense of community, perhaps, and that offers hope. They say no one thinks these ambitious goals are realistic, but fighting for them is what they do. Can you elaborate a bit about how you see such local appropriations of agendas like the UN 2030 agenda? Then the second question to Robert is by Daniela. Is decoupling a proposal that is present in the Green New Deal? In what ways does the proposal of a Green New Deal dialogues with decolonial productions and the search for popular sovereignty in the Global South? And the final question so far for Robert, and probably the final one anyway, is my question goes to Robert Fletcher. How do you interpret the interplay between mainstream environmental research community, which agrees with and advances the decoupling hypothesis, the UN SDGs, and the Agenda 2030, and on the other hand, more critical scholars in IR and other disciplines? This is by Vinicius. I don't think I've said that. I'm always forgetting to say who asked the question. For instance, communities such as the Earth System Governance insist on mainstream political solutions to the climate crisis, working with scenarios in which, one, the private sector, for instance, Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the ESG principles, etc., and two, new technologies like geoengineering are central for solving the climate crisis. What are the limits of these perceptions? Are mainstream environmental scholars deliberately over-optimistic or simply naive?
Well, thank you very much for these excellent questions. I'll try to respond to them as succinctly as possible, in the hopes that we'll still have a bit more time to address some other issues. In regard to the first question on the SDGs as a whole, the first thing I want to say is, for me, the issue is not so much the goals, whether or not they're realistic or achievable or not. The main issue is how they are intended to be achieved. Right? That, I think, is the important focus here. What type of mechanisms? And what I've seen in a lot of the mainstream policy advice are proposals that to me seem quite problematic in carrying out a logic that is not likely to lead towards any kind of sustainable future. Of course, these are global goals. They're designed to be implemented differently in different societies, in different communities. And so I can totally imagine many scenarios in which the goals can be used as leverage points to try to achieve things that can be useful for community level development. And I think an interesting way to think about this is actually through an analysis that one of my colleagues did, looking at previous rounds of international development in rural communities in the highlands of the Andes, where he found, in contrast to what a lot of post-development scholars were saying at the time, that a lot of the people that he worked with were actually very much interested in seeing development happen. And so he suggested it as an alternative approach rather than critiquing development, what you should do, and he explicitly invoked Lacan in this, is to not compromise one's desire for development, to demand of the people who are promising development that they actually fulfill their goals and to hold them accountable for doing so, to actually use the at least fantasy or promise of development as a leverage point to try to push for more than was occurring right now. And I think approaching the SDGs in that same manner could be potentially quite fruitful. In regard to the second question about the Green New Deal, yeah, this is very interesting. I actually had a quotation that explicitly talked about the importance of decoupling in the Green New Deal that I thought about including on one of my slides, but didn't update there. So at least for some proponents of the Green New Deal, decoupling is very central, and I think it's implicit in most proposals for this. A recent interesting analysis of Green New Deal proposals, and of course there's different ones in different places, was produced by a couple of prominent degrowth scholars, Georges Callis and Jason Hickel. They have a recent article comparing the two approaches that can be quite interesting. Does the Green New Deal dialogue with decolonial approaches and search for popular sovereignty? Not to the extent that I've seen. For the most part, I've seen this proposed by national level politics, primarily in high-income societies of the global north. I did just a couple days ago see a response to Green Deal proposals calling itself a new Red Deal that was produced by a collection of indigenous activists and groups, I think also primarily in the global north. I haven't had a chance to look into this in detail yet, but I see that as an intriguing response to Green New Deal proposals. What I've seen most is dialogue around decoupling, and to the extent to which the decoupling proposal is actually very much a global north specific phenomenon, and to the extent to which it's actually appropriate for and resonates with issues happening in the global south, and if there's a potential to decolonize degrowth, which I think is a very interesting discussion to follow. The final question in terms of mainstream critical scholar, mainstream and environmental scholars. I don't think most of my colleagues, especially, I'd consider over-optimistic or naive. I think for the most part, the effort to engage in mainstream policy discussions is very pragmatic, right? If you want to be asked to policy tables to discuss issues, if you want to have your research published in Nature or Science, it really does not help to mention the word capitalism, right? It doesn't really help your case. And so taking a very critical stance positions yourself in a particular way, and so you're not able to be part of specific discussions. So I think many people choose to adopt a particular perspective because they realize that this is something that will allow them to get in dialogue with the people that they want to try to influence. And I really understand that motivation. I think many also people think addressing the logic of capital accumulation is just too big to tackle. It's just too hard as a hook to actually engage with, and so choose not to focus on that, and instead focus on things that are more realistic to address. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I do think that it's quite possible that a more appropriate strategy is to establish something, a division of labor, where certain people are speaking a more moderate language, engaging in policy discussions. Other people are saying, no, what we're doing here is not enough, and what we really need to be doing is confronting these things in a more systematic way, right? And having pointed that out, it potentially allows the people engaging in policy discussions to adopt a stronger stance than they would be otherwise. At the same time that more radical types of critics are most likely not going to be invited to the policy table because of the things they're saying. And you have to kind of choose, what your positionality is going to be and whether engaging in those discussions is important to you. I'm sorry that this took so long. I was hoping to speak more succinctly and have a bit more time, but thanks so much for all of this engagement. I appreciate it.
No, I think you have spoken very succinctly. Thank you so much. Look, we still had more questions, but I think we've reached our time limits. There was still one question for Deborah, one question for Robert, and one for the whole table. So maybe we can forward this to you by email or something like that, so we can continue this conversation. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming here today and sharing with us your fascinating research. And I think we can all agree it has been an incredible day, and this amount of questions and the fact that we could stay here even longer, I think is testimony to that. So thank you once again. Thank you, the public and the interpreters and my fellow organizers, and it is Núcleo as well for all your incredible work. And tomorrow we have our final day of our seminar. I hope you can join us. It's on desiring violence, violence in international relations. We'll have Katarina Kinval, Andrea Zevnik, and Rosanna Hayes. So thank you once again for everything, and hope I can see you tomorrow or at some other time. Thank you.